Hi guys, my name is Sam Henderson. Sarah has asked me to deliver a couple of lectures to you guys, mainly around the topics of strength and power development, a little bit on periodization as well, to help you with your coursework for this module, but also just to give you a slightly different perspective on kind of working with athletes in the applied world over a range of different sports as opposed to necessarily just focusing on football. Okay, so a little bit of background on me. I Some of you may have met me before if you're at the university, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but if not since then. I work as an applied strength and conditioning coach across quite a large number of sports. So ranging obviously from Olympic weightlifting, which is the main sport I work in. I also work with rugby players, golfers, triathletes, CrossFit athletes. So a very kind of broad spectrum. So the main thing I want you guys to get from this is a good understanding as to how all these concepts kind of apply in the real world, and to give you the knowledge to be able to apply all these different concepts to a vast or quite a large range of athletes. Obviously, once you've finished studying and you get out into the work environment, you can't always choose which group of athletes you want to work with. But what's really important is that you have a good understanding of the key principles. So regardless of who you work with, you can apply those principles to make sure that you're getting the best possible result for that athlete. Obviously, you don't need me to tell you the demands of different sports, and even the individual athletes within different sports can vary quite a lot, which is why it's important that you can bring together key concepts, apply them to individuals to get the best result. A, for the individual either on their own, or B, for the individual within a team sport. Okay, so today, obviously, first thing we want to look at when we come to talking about developing strength and power and looking at different training methods for how you do that and how you would put that into a program is understanding the key physiology. Okay, so once you understand the physiology, then you can start to manipulate that to apply it into real life kind of training application. Okay, so let's get started. So the learning outcomes for today. One of the key things I want you to understand is the relationship between maximal force production and power production. Okay, so quite commonly, strength and power is kind of put together in one thing, because obviously to a lot of people it looks the same. Okay, but the key thing that I need you guys to understand is the two, whilst they work together, are quite different, and obviously the methods that then you would use to develop them with an athlete, again, need to be quite different. Okay, and also the way that you would look at an athlete and decide where this athlete is weak and what they need to work on, okay, is a key part of being able to bring that athlete to their peak level of performance. Okay, now obviously to do that, you need to have a good understanding of the physiological underpinning of strength and power development. And then you can start to consider how you would manipulate training protocols to achieve the most appropriate adaptations for an athlete, like we say, depending upon their sport, their position in that sport, if it's a team sport, based around where they are in a training cycle. Okay, so how it correlates to how often they compete, when they're competing, how far away from competing they are. Okay, all these kind of variables will affect how you approach developing the athlete's strength and power. Okay, so obviously it's important, like I say, that you have a good definition of what strength and what power is to be able to differentiate between the two. Okay, so obviously maximal strength. All right, so obviously it's really easy to measure, easy to see. All right, it's just the maximum amount of force that can be objected on an external object. Okay, so obviously this is probably stuff that you guys have all done before. A simple strength test, you're talking about 1 rep maxes on, say, squat, bench press, depending upon the sport or the athlete, or depending just upon what exercise you're using to measure that maximal strength. Okay, that's nice and straightforward. Okay, the next concept you need to think about is velocity. Okay, so velocity is just the speed of an object motion. Now, when we're talking about object, all right, that can be a football, a rugby ball, a tennis ball, a golf ball, or it can be just the person's body. Yeah, so if you're thinking of, say, running, change of direction, the object that's in motion is a human body. Okay, so again, that's an important concept. Now, obviously, power just ties those two things together. Okay, so power is your force, so your maximal strength times by your velocity. Okay, so the most powerful athletes in sport, they have the ability to apply high forces at high speed. Okay, and that's the key. All right, and depending on the sport will depend on the demand for an athlete to be able to do this. Okay, so just a very simple example just to help you get your head around the difference between the two now, okay? If you take the sport of powerlifting, okay, so powerlifting is very simply, you've got to do 1 rep max, back squat, deadlift, bench press, okay? The main measure there is just the amount of weight you lift, and because those lifts can be performed quite slowly, which is when maximal strength is most commonly seen, okay, is very much a strength-based sport in the sense of they have to produce a lot of force, but they don't have to do it quickly, okay? Now, if we flip that on its head, all right, and you take Olympic weightlifting, for example, okay, so if you've not seen Olympic weightlifting before, we're talking about a snatch and a clean and jerk, okay? If you're not familiar with those exercises, then I would recommend that you look them up, because those exercises can be used to really help develop athletes' strength and power, okay, both. So it's very useful exercises for you to be able to get your head around and be able to learn how to teach, okay? So Olympic weightlifting, yes, you need strength, okay, but the nature of the movement, the way obviously the bar goes from the floor to above your head, okay, that's not something you can do slowly if you want to do with the highest possible weight, okay? So this is where power is really expressed, because you need the maximal strength obviously to pull the weight from the floor, but you also need the speed to transfer that barbell from the floor to all the way above your head, as opposed to, say, a back squat or a deadlift, where you can move much slower, almost grind out a rep. All right, I'm sure any of you who do strength training, you know, when you get close towards your maxes, you can appreciate how the difference in bar speed changes. Obviously, as you get towards max, that bar is going to be moving a lot slower, okay? So the ability of an athlete to express that power is a crucial element of sports performance, all right? Obviously, it doesn't matter what the sport is, okay? So whether it's football, rugby, any team sport like that, or an individual sport such as sprinting, hurdling, long jump, javelin, it doesn't really matter, okay? The ability of the athlete to express that high power output is very often what separates athletes of different levels, okay? So if you were to take, for example, a club level 100-meter runner versus an Olympic level 100-meter runner, okay, they might have identical technique. Just say, for argument's sake, they both have perfect technique, okay? So then what starts to differentiate them is their ability to express high power outputs, okay? Now, the key thing to focus on when we're talking about high power, like I say, is the force and the velocity, all right? So just carry on with the sprinter analogy, all right? If you're a high level sprinter, or just a sprinter at all, what you need to make sure you're doing is applying the maximum amount of force you can in a very short time frame, okay? So if we're talking kind of ground contact time, when you're sprinting, you know, you're talking 1/10 of a second. So you have a very short time to apply a maximal amount of force, okay? And like I say, the difference between athletes of different levels is how much force they can apply in that time, okay? Which is obviously the nature of strength and power training, and that's something that you're going to want to develop within your athletes, all right? So just to back up that point, okay, this is a force velocity curve, all right? So obviously you can see you've got velocity and you've got force, all right? Now, when you look at that curve, what you'll see, so kind of towards the top left, you've got where obviously velocity is highest, force is lowest, and where force is highest, velocity is lowest, okay? And then you'll see you've got that dotted curve there, which is obviously power. And you'll see there the interaction between the two, that peak power tends to occur at some kind of midpoint, okay? Now that midpoint is going to vary depending upon your athlete, and where we want that point to be, again, is going to vary depending upon your sport, whether the athlete needs to apply that power to a light object, so either their body weight, a football, a tennis ball, or whether they need to apply that force to a heavy object, so either another athlete, if we're talking about rugby, so if you think of a scrum in rugby, a barbell, if you're talking about powerlifting. It varies very much depending on the sport, and even within sports, it might vary at different parts of the game, okay, or based on position. Okay, so when we're talking about physiology of developing strength and power, obviously, just a quick recap on muscle structure. Obviously, this is going to be a big thing we're looking to change in terms of physiology when we're training for strength and power. Okay, so key thing here, obviously you can see you've got your motor units, all right, so groups of muscle fibers bunched together. you got your myofibrils, okay? So obviously the individual muscle fibers and the composition of those muscle fibers, all right? And then also when you look at the bottom end of the picture, all right, a couple of things we're going to be talking about is your sarcomere, all right, obviously actin, myosin. So when we're talking about muscle contraction, sliding filament theory, all right, it's important you know about actin, myosin, how that works. Again, that's something we're going to talk about in a bit more detail in a second, all right? And obviously sarcomere, when we talk about sarcomere lengths, it's important that you can visualize where that is, and obviously how that fits within the muscle structure, okay? So muscle action, all right, now again, this should be something you guys have already done in the past. If you're not, then make sure you have a good recap on it, because muscle action is a key thing that can limit power production, all right? So as a recap, obviously the time it takes for those muscle cross bridges to attach and detach, so again, sliding filament theory, it takes a fixed amount of time, all right? So the total number of cross bridges attached decreases with the increased velocity of muscle shortening, okay? So if less cross bridges can attach and detach, all right, because of the short time frame of the movement, then obviously we're going to be able to apply less force, okay? So that makes the amount of force generated by the muscle dependent on the number of attached cross bridges. So force production obviously decreases as the velocity of the contraction increases, all right, which means that obviously power is going to be maximized at submaximal forces, okay? Again, if you use a powerlifting example, when you're going for a 1 rep max, your power is reduced, but your force is increased. So if we're looking at maximizing your power, we're going to be working submaximally, okay? Maximal muscular power is obviously therefore determined by the parameters of this force-velocity relationship, okay? So maximal force, maximum velocity of shortening, okay, so how quickly the muscles can contract, and obviously the degree of curvature, so by that we mean the range of motion that your muscle fibers are going to be working through, all right? Now obviously to improve that maximal power, which is the goal of a training program that we're going to be putting together, it can be achieved either, okay, through increasing maximal force, so strength, or increasing the velocity, okay, or if there's a change in the degree of curvature, so a change in the range of motion, all right? And the key thing that obviously you need to be able to differentiate as a practitioner is what the athlete needs, okay? So is it that the athlete needs to increase their maximal strength, so their force, or is it that they need to be able to increase the velocity, okay, so the speed at which they can kind of project that force onto the object, dependent upon what their sport is, okay? Now, going back to that initial picture that I showed you at the beginning, okay, so the ability of the skeletal muscle to generate force is dependent upon the sarcomere length, okay? So this is again when we're talking about the range of motion, all right? So the greatest force production occurs when the sarcomere length provides for the optimal overlap between the actin and myosin filaments, okay? So if we go back here, all right, you've got your sarcomere there, and we want that crossover between the actin and myosin filaments so that they can bind as effectively as possible, okay? If that gap is too big, they can't bind, they can't detach and reattach as quickly, which obviously limits how much force can be produced, okay? Again, a real world kind of example of this, you know, simple kind of strength exercise if you're in the gym doing a bench press, obviously, you know, the bigger the range of motion, the harder it is for you to lift the same amount of weight. So if you say you do, you know, like a partial range of motion, like a half rep, okay, where the sarcomere never gets too stretched, it's much easier to lift more weight than it is if you bring the bar all the way down to your chest, okay? So, like I say, the optimal kind of overlap between actin myosin filaments cross bridge interaction is maximal, which allows for the greatest levels of tension development, okay, which is what we need to produce maximal force. Force production is obviously impaired when sarcomere lengths are shortened below the optimal length, okay, like we're saying, due to the overlap of actin filaments from opposite ends of the sarcomere and the compression of myosin filaments when it comes in contact with a Z disc, okay? So your Z disc, you can see here it's marked as your Z line, all right? It's basically, that's what we're talking about when we talk about Z disc, all right? Stretching a sarcomere beyond the optimal length obviously reduces the force production capacity, and at longer length, the cross-bridge interaction is decreased as a result of that lack of overlap, okay? Again, you can see the same kind of thing here. All right, so you've got your myosin filament there in the middle. You've got your Z discs at the end. You've got your actin filaments. Again, the kind of little yellow curly things. So when that gets too stretched, the interaction between the two is obviously reduced, limiting the amount of force that you can produce. Okay, so again, talking about different ranges of motion and how that affects power output. All right, I've picked deliberately 3 examples from 3 quite different sports. All right, so let's start off with the runner. Okay, so the triathlete that you've got there. All right, now obviously running, you obviously your muscles of your lower legs, or just your legs, are obviously moving through what you could class as partial ranges of motion every time you take a stride. Okay, so obviously when you stride out, you're taking obviously a reasonably long step, but you're not stretching out as far as you can if you were to say do a lunge. All right, obviously the degree of the angle at your knee obviously isn't as great as what it would be if you was gonna do say a full lunge. All right, so you're working in a range where that optimal kind of length so that you can consistently produce a good amount of force. If you were to compare obviously a 400-meter run versus 400 meters of say walking lunges, it's going to feel a lot harder. You're going to move a lot slower because it's much harder for you to produce the same amount of force as quickly, which obviously is what you need to run fast. Okay. Similarly, there you've got the picture from the rugby game in the top corner. All right. Now, obviously, again, there when you look at the body position of the number 12, all right, in the red shirt, the position he's in there, none of his muscle groups have moved through a particularly big range of motion. All right, so you can see you've got the small bend in the knee. Obviously, there's more of a bend at the hip, but again, he's put himself in a strong position to apply a lot of force. Because again, if you were say to compare that position to either like say a full deadlift position or a full squat position, it's a much shorter range of motion, which means you can apply a lot more force to poor Sonny Bill Williams there. As he's making the tackle. All right, now obviously in comparison to that, in the very bottom corner, you've got the picture there of the Olympic weightlifter performing a snatch. All right, now obviously he's in that full range bottom of a squat position. All right, so you can see the difference in the degree of range of motion compared to say the rugby player at top. So it's going to be much harder for him to produce the same amount of force to stand up from that position than if he was say a 90-degree knee bend. All right. Power production. Okay, so power production, the ability of the muscle to generate maximal power, again, is influenced by the type of muscle action involved. Okay, so when we talk about muscle action, again, a bit of a recap. Obviously, we've got eccentric, concentric, or isometric muscle contractions. All right, so eccentric, obviously, is a negative phase of a movement. Concentric is the part where the muscle is shortening in length. Okay, so if we're talking about a bicep curl, lifting your arm up, or obviously an isometric contraction, muscles don't change in length, but they're still applying force. Okay, obviously in a sport environment, most often actions involve a combination of all 3. All right, very rarely in the sporting kind of arena are we just performing one or the other. Obviously, if we think of running, change of direction, making a rugby tackle. All right, different muscle groups are interacting in different ways and performing different kinds of contraction. Okay, and again, an important thing to remember or to kind of cast your mind back to is the stretch shortening cycle. Okay, so maximal muscular power again is superior in movements involving a stretch shortening cycle. Okay, so again, we can use running as an easy example. Every time you take a stride, or every time you jump, or every time you kick a football, there is an element of the stretch shortening cycle involved. It's not something we're going to talk about too much now, but when we start to talk about power, obviously utilizing that stretch shortening cycle is a big thing. All right, and if you've ever come across plyometric training or used plyometric training, okay, a big part of that is that stretch shortening cycle. All right, within obviously those kind of things that we spoke about there, all right, you've got your morphological factors. Okay, so morphological things within the muscle, actual structural changes to the muscle fibers. Okay, so obviously a big thing that can affect both obviously power production because of its effect on both maximal force production and maximal velocity, okay, is your muscle fiber types. All right, so I'm sure you don't need me to remind you of the differences between type 1, type 2, type 2B fibers. Okay, so obviously it goes without saying that dependent upon which muscle fiber type you have predominantly within the muscle groups that are working, it's going to affect your ability to generate maximal power, okay? So when we're talking about kind of muscle fiber types now, obviously the power that you can produce during a movement is dictated by the contractile capacity of the muscles involved. The contractile capacity is influenced primarily by muscle fiber type composition and then architectural features within the muscle, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, obviously, force velocity properties of a muscle are determined by the fiber type contribution to the whole muscle area, and type 2 fibers have a greater capacity to generate power per unit of cross-sectional area. Obviously, type 2 muscle fibers, they have a high sarcoplasmic reticulum, they have high myofibrillar adenosine triphosphate A's activities, bit of mouthful there, okay, which allows you to produce high velocities and short contraction times, all right? So just as a little bit of a comparison there for you, all right, type 2 muscle fibers can split ATPase, all right, so obviously that's what they need to do to produce ATP, approximately 600 times per second versus approximately 300 times a second for type 1 muscle fibers, okay, which obviously speeds up cross-bridge cycling time, okay, so the speed of muscle contraction, which obviously then in turn affects the ability to develop force quickly, all right. Type 1 fibers, on the other hand, obviously work on the opposite. They obviously have low ATPase activity, low velocity, long contraction times, hence why they're called slow twitch muscle fibers, all right. And again, just another kind of more relatable example there, velocity has been shown to vary from approximately 0.8 fiber lengths per second in type 1 muscle fibers to approximately 3.5 fiber lengths per second, to up to around 5.6 fiber lengths per second in type 2A and type 2B or type 2X muscle fibers. All right, obviously, that's great when we're talking about short, fast muscle contractions, but as you all know, you can't maintain that level of output over a long period of time. Okay, now another big factor when we're talking about developing maximal force is muscle cross-sectional area. Okay, so maximal force generated by a single muscle fiber is directly proportional to the cross-sectional area of that muscle fiber, regardless of fiber type. Okay, so obviously by cross-sectional area, we basically do just mean the size of the muscle fiber. All right. Due to the fact that power is heavily influenced by obviously maximal force, a muscle fiber with a greater cross-sectional area can therefore generate higher maximal power. Okay. In response to training, changes in the max force of single muscle fibers are proportional to changes in fiber cross-sectional area. All right, increases in fiber cross-sectional area are brought about through increases in the size and number of myofibrils within the muscle fiber. Okay, these hypertrophic adaptations occur in both types of muscle fiber in response to heavy training. All right, but as I'm sure, as you know, this affects to a greater degree type 2 muscle fibers. Okay, and again, heavy strength training is a very effective stimulus for eliciting a hypertrophic response in muscle, and training induced increases in cross-sectional area and force are typically accompanied by improvements in maximal muscular power. Obviously, again, if we go back to the beginning, that's because maximal power is heavily influenced by maximal force production. Okay, so you can already see here how we can manipulate training and the goals of training, and obviously by extension of that, what training involves to increase strength and power. Okay, increases in cross-sectional area following heavy strength training are expected to be reduced as the training age of the athlete increases. Okay, so obviously, you know, as I'm sure you're aware, when you first start doing any kind of training, the gains at the beginning, obviously what we call beginner's gains, can happen quite fast. But as you progress through, or as you've been training for longer and longer, then those gains can start to slow down, particularly if you're trying to do the same kind of stuff, which is why there's a lot of variables we can manipulate, which we'll talk about later on, to make sure that A, those gains don't slow down, or B, that we can manipulate training variables appropriately to create enough variation so that the body keeps adapting. All right, now obviously it goes without saying, the degree of muscle hypertrophy is dependent on the type of training and the program variables. Okay, so obviously, you're not going to get muscle hypertrophy from running 10K, so we're talking about the intensity, the volume, and the frequency of training. Obviously, the type of training we're doing, the exercises that we're using, and how we're performing those exercises, they're going to have obviously a big effect on how much muscle hypertrophy we develop and how sustained that increase in muscle hypertrophy is as you progress through training, whether that's over a 1-year period, 4-year period, 10-year period. Okay. Now ballistic training. Okay, so if you've ever done any kind of say bench throws, jump squats, med ball throws, okay, that's what we refer to as ballistic training. So anything where you project an object, obviously requires you to use lighter loads, which is typically too small to elicit the necessary stimulus required to initiate a significant hypertrophic response. Okay, so again, you can see here how we adapt the training to meet the demands of what we're looking for, which are going to vary depending upon the athlete, the demands of their sport, the demands of their position in their sport, their training age. So lots of variables to consider, which when it comes to obviously your coursework and your critiquing a training program and planning a training program, these are all things that you can factor in either to criticize the training program and tell us what's right or what's wrong with it, but obviously the things that you need to justify when you're writing a training program, and factoring in and explaining why you've chosen to do what you've done. Okay. Another factor, a morphological factor when we're talking about developing strength and power, okay, is the angle of pronation. All right, so this refers to the way the muscle fibers are arranged around a joint. Okay, so you can see there, you've got generally two different types. Okay, you've got muscle fibers that are arranged in parallel, and then you've got what we call muscle fibers that are arranged in series. Okay, so obviously you can see when they're in parallel, effectively all the muscle fibers are aligned in a straight line in relation to the joint. Okay, whereas when they're in series, you can see they're at much more of an angle. All right, now what you can see there is when those muscle fibers are arranged at much more of an angle, okay, you've got much more muscle fibers that are attaching to that particular joint. Okay, so with the muscle fibers that are arranged in parallel, they've got a long length, so it takes a long time to contract. They've got a small cross section, so they can produce a small amount of force, whereas the muscle fibers arranged in series or that have what we call a higher pronation angle. Okay, there's a much larger cross section, allowing them to produce much more force. Okay, they're shorter in length, so they can contract a little bit quicker. Okay, so again, a little bit of a definition there for you. The pronation angle of a muscle is just the angle between the muscle's fascicles and the line of action. Okay, so line of action, the direction that we're moving the joint. Okay, as pronation angle increases, more sarcomeres can be arranged, and the more force that can be produced. Okay, an increase in pronation angle allows for muscle fibers to shorten less for a given amount of movement. Okay, due to the rotation of the muscle fibers, increasing the likelihood that the fibers with a greater angle of pronation operates closer to its optimal length. Okay, now obviously in response to heavy strength training, the pronation angle is thought to increase. Okay, whereas in response to sprint training, it's thought to decrease. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit further down the line. Okay, but you can have a think about now as to why that might be. All right, obviously, these theories are based on observations of population differences. So comparing bodybuilders, which display greater pronation angles and greater cross-sectional areas, to untrained subjects, but then also comparing highly trained sprinters with lesser trained sprinters and untrained controls. Okay, so similar, very different populations, but comparing the changes in how those muscle fibers are arranged. Okay, now obviously, when we talk about bodybuilding, we're talking typically about hypertrophy training, but to a degree where we're not necessarily worrying about maximal force production. Okay, which is something we'll talk about later on. Now, obviously, as well as the morphological factors that influence force and power development and expression, okay, obviously there's a lot of neural factors as well. So obviously, when we talk about neural factors, we're talking about your nervous system, okay? So you can see there, you've got another little diagram as to how the nervous system, or how muscle fibers and your nervous system work together. All right, so obviously you've got motor units. So motor units are kind of groups of muscle fibers grouped together. Obviously you've got nerves that innervate these motor units. All right, and then you've got obviously your motor neuron cell body, so where those signals come from, and then you've got the axon terminals, which is where those nerves attach to the individual muscle fibers. Okay, so nothing too complicated there. So the force produced by a muscle is related to the number and type of motor units recruited. Okay, so motor unit recruitment is a big factor when it comes to expressing strength and power. Okay, so motor units are recruited in a systematic order of increasing force according to the size principle. Okay, so the size principle means that small motor units that innervate type 1 fibers are activated first, while the force requirements are quite low, and progressively larger motor neurons that activate type 2 and type 2B or type 2X fibers are typically activated second when the demand for force production is higher. Okay, so you can see there how that can influence maximal strength expression and also power expression. Okay, so during contractions typically required for maximal power production, the recruitment of high threshold motor units is beneficial as they innervate large number of high force producing muscle fibers. So obviously those type 2 and type 2B muscle fibers. All right, so the ability to rapidly recruit high threshold motor units has a big influence on how much power can be produced. Okay, so obviously there is a big benefit to being able to activate those higher threshold motor units. Okay, so the ones that tend to be recruited as the demand for force increases quickly, especially when we're talking about sprinting. Okay, so the maximum force capability of a motor unit has been estimated to vary by up to 50 times. Okay, so that's obviously going to lead to a big difference in terms of the amount of force that can be produced. Obviously, training can result in increased motor unit recruitment, preferential recruitment of high threshold motor units, which is a key factor for maximal force production. All right, and lowering the threshold that those high threshold motor units can be recruited at. Okay, and obviously the lower that threshold, the better when we're talking about improving power for sports performance. All right, now another factor, okay, is motor unit firing frequency. Okay, so motor unit firing frequency represents the rate that neural impulses are transmitted from the motor neuron to the muscle fibers. Okay, increasing this firing frequency enhances the magnitude of force generated during a contraction. All right, so it's been estimated that force of contraction can increase between 300, all right, and 1500% when the firing frequency of a motor unit is increased from its minimum to its maximum rate. Okay, obviously then that means motor unit firing frequency can impact the rate of force development. Okay, and during ballistic contractions, motor units have been reported to begin firing at very high frequencies, followed by a rapid decline. Okay, so again, this just obviously kind of explains why you can produce a high amount of force quickly, but obviously, you can't maintain that for a long period of time. All right, now the high initial firing frequency is believed to be associated with an increase in the number of what we call doublet discharges, all right, which again increase rate of force development, but again is only maintained for quite a short period of time. All right, so by influencing the force and rate of force development of a muscle contraction, motor unit firing frequency plays a big role in the development of maximum muscular power. Obviously, training enhancement of maximum motor unit firing frequency has been proposed as a possible mechanism, okay, driving improvements in neuromuscular performance. And a research study showed that weightlifters displayed greater maximum motor unit firing frequency during a voluntary contraction of the quadriceps compared with untrained controls. Okay, so effectively, that's just showing that firing frequency is or can be changed as a result of training. All right, and obviously they've used Olympic weightlifters, which obviously have to move heavy objects quickly. All right, so obviously the nature and the specificity of their training has led to an increase in motor unit firing frequency, allowing them to produce more force faster. Okay, now another thing we want to talk about is the motor unit synchronization. Okay, now again, as we said before when we were talking about muscle contractions, the movements that you see in a sport, they don't happen on their own. Okay, it's not one individual muscle group that's responsible. All right, so motor unit synchronization occurs when two or more motor units are activated concurrently. Okay, so again, basics of muscle action. All right, muscle groups don't work on their own, especially when performing complex multi-joint movements. All right, so synchronization of motor units is nervous system adaptation that assists with the co-activation of numerous different muscles in order to enhance rate of force development. Okay, so when we're talking about that co-activation, let's just take any kind of movement that involves any kind of rapid hip extension or triple extension. All right, obviously we're talking about full extension of the ankle, the knee, and the hip. So obviously you can see there's a huge number of muscle groups that are involved in performing that movement pattern. The more synchronized that movement pattern is between muscle groups, then obviously the more force you can expect to produce. Okay, so synchronization is one of the strategies for intermuscular coordination, and obviously there could impact force and rate of force development during complex multi-joint movements, as opposed to isolated single joint movements where synchronization obviously doesn't have as much of an impact. All right, synchronization between muscles may be a strategy to simplify and coordinate the activity of muscles in the control of mechanically unstable joints, which again allow for greater transmission of muscular power in complex movements. And intermuscular coordination describes the appropriate activation of agonist, synergist, and antagonist muscles, during a movement. Okay, again, obviously agonists, synergists, and antagonists, key part of understanding muscle action. All right, and obviously, hopefully you guys have got a good understanding when we're talking about, again, those key sporting movements or multi-joint movements of what muscle groups are. Obviously the agonist, synergist, and antagonist. Okay, now another thing just to mention there, obviously we're talking about coordinating the activity of muscles in control of mechanically unstable joints, allowing for greater transmission of muscular power. Okay, so one of the most probably unstable joints in your body is the shoulder joint. All right, now when we're talking about transmission of muscular power, again, the old analogy, you can't shoot a cannon from a canoe, applies hugely when we're talking about developing power around the shoulder joint. Okay, so obviously the way muscles interact provide stability to your shoulder joint, which is inherently unstable because of its design. All right, so obviously without that stability, the amount of force you can generate in a movement that involves the shoulder, which obviously is a lot of sporting movements, we're talking about javelin, shot put, tennis, golf, throwing a rugby ball, catching a rugby ball. There is a huge number of sporting movements that involve your shoulder joint. All right, so we need to have that stability to be able to transmit the maximum amount of power. Okay, and this is where you can see a big difference in the power that can be produced between beginner athletes and obviously highly trained athletes, in obviously that motor unit synchronization, giving them much more control over the stability of their joints and being able to generate much more power in sporting movements. Okay, so again, back to your agonists, antagonists. All right, for highly effective and efficient movement, agonist activation needs to be supplemented by increased synergist activity and decreased co-contraction of the antagonists. Okay, the coordinated activation of these muscles is required to generate the greatest possible force in the direction of movement. Okay, so another little analogy here, it's obviously, if you say you're driving a car, you don't drive your car with the handbrake on. Okay, so if we're talking about producing maximal muscle force, all right, we don't want to be doing it with the handbrake on. All right, so say you're kicking a football, let's just say obviously your quadriceps are going to be the agonist, your hamstrings are going to be the antagonist. If your quadriceps and your hamstrings are contracting at the same time, then the amount of force you can put into the ball is going to be much lower because your hamstrings are pulling your quadriceps, not pulling your quadriceps, but pulling your knee joint back as your quadriceps are trying to extend it, limiting the amount of power you can produce. All right, which obviously is always going to happen to a degree to prevent hyperextension of the joint, but the more interaction there is between those two muscle groups, then the more force you're going to be able to produce. Okay, so obviously it's only with the precise timing and level of activation and relaxation of the agonists, synergists, and antagonists that power flow through that kinetic chain is going to be optimized. Impulse on the ground, okay, if you talk about running, is going to be maximized, and obviously performance in terms of takeoff velocity is going to be maximized. Okay, so obviously the ability to generate that maximal power is considerably influenced by that intermuscular coordination, okay, which again is something that obviously comes through training, through developing athletes, through strength and conditioning, all right, and engaging muscle groups similar to that they're going to be used in obviously in sport to help develop that synchronization, okay? So when we're talking about obviously developing strength and power and the practical considerations that come with that, obviously now we've had a chance just to have a talk over the physiological adaptations, all right? What's important for you to think about is how those physiological adaptations differ with training age, okay? So, once you've been training for a certain amount of time, are those adaptations going to be less or more so with regards to each of the things we spoke about there, okay? And then obviously how those adaptations differ with training style, okay? And obviously that's the key thing that you want to be able to manipulate to create the adaptation that you want. So understanding how different styles of training affect those different physiological adaptations, all right, is going to determine what you put into your training program to help your athlete, okay? And obviously following on from that, or as part of that, how do you assess which physiological adaptations are most beneficial to the athlete? Okay, so what tests can we use to assess how or which physiological adaptations are going to be most worthwhile chasing to get the athlete the best possible result in obviously what's likely to be a restricted amount of training time. Okay, obviously the key or one of the big factors with working in strength and conditioning in a sport is obviously whilst you may be focused on the training or the non kind of skill specific aspects of training, they may also have a coach or multiple coaches who are going to be involved in the more skill specific aspects of training for their sport, okay? Which means inevitably if the athlete has a limited window for either training in terms of just a day-to-day, week-to-week sense, just obviously say they've only got 3-4 hours a day to train, if that, depending on their level, they want to be able to maximize that time, which means for you as a strength and conditioning coach, you need to make sure that their time with you is maximized in the best possible way, okay? So obviously by extension of that, knowing which physiological adaptations we're chasing and designing a training program to fit is very, very important, okay? And again, like I say, that leads into the next question about how we might design that training program to manipulate the adaptations that are produced, okay? And then obviously, again, thinking about the timescale that we might be working with an athlete and how their season may change or how multiple training cycles may fit together, how might we structure a periodized program to first develop physiological adaptations, okay? But more importantly, translate these adaptations into improved sports performance, okay? Because ultimately, your job might be to prepare the athlete using methods available in the gym, but that's not what they're judged on. So by extension, not what you're judged on, okay? Because again, using the example of an athlete who might have multiple coaches, limited training time, your worth to them is dependent on how much you can help them improve in their sports performance, not just how much you can improve their performance in the gym. Okay, so again, let's say you take a runner, 100-meter sprinter, and you take their back squat from being 150 kilos to 200 kilos, but there's no change in their 100-meter sprint time, then where's the value in that extra 50 kilos that they've added on to their 1 rep max? Again, obviously that's an extreme example, but you get the gist, all right? As a strength and conditioning coach in a sport, all right, you're not just trying to improve their performance in the gym, you're trying to improve their performance in their sporting event, okay? So looking at obviously a full training cycle, how you would periodize that training cycle to get the physiological adaptations that you need, but also that translation into sport-specific performance are very important. Okay, now obviously periodization is something we'll talk about I think in 2 weeks' time. Okay, but I want you to have a think about that for athletes specific to your sport, all right, so that when we come to talk about it, you can relate to it a little bit better. All right, so that's it from me for today. Obviously, if you need to get in touch with me, if you've got any questions about anything that we spoke about, then get in touch with Sarah, send her an email, just detail your question on the email so she can forward it on to me. All right, now obviously with the nature of how things are working at the moment, what I will do, I'll gather all those questions up, all right, and then in the last lecture with me, I'll do a bit of a Q&A just to answer all the questions you might have, all right, and like I say, I want you to obviously understand these physiological adaptations and the basis for changes in strength and power, okay, but I always want you to maintain a question in the back of your mind as to how is this going to help the athlete that I'm working with, okay, because again, like I say, the most important aspect of strength and conditioning is you improve the athlete's sports performance, okay? So I hope you've enjoyed that, guys. Like I say, if you've got any questions, feel free to send them over and we'll go through them in the final lecture, all right? Have a good week.